Just the last 5 places I visited I haven't caught up with because I've just come back from Brazil and with seeing the museum in Sao Paulo. So it's a pleasure to be here. So I've been looking as part of my research into child migration. I've been looking at how museums internationally represent migration. And 2 questions have really dominated my thoughts. How do museums engage with the present crisis on migration, where history is unfurling really day by day? And then there's so much rhetoric about museums changing lives, but how do we measure this? Where is the evidence that museums can support and enhance migrants' lives? So with this in mind, I thought I'd do you a quick tour of some of the museums I visited in Europe, Australasia and South America in the last year. Some focusing specifically on migration, but some others not. I've become very interested in the significance of sites of memory and museums' contribution to placemaking. I think Berlin will talk about more, but take for example the Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp. It's located in the same building from where 2 million people left in search of a new line at the end of 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and you can tell that because you can see the corrugated iron both in the picture, my picture, and the picture of the museum, and that sense of place. And similarly, in the bottom, you have Ballenstadt emigration in Hamburg. There again, they pioneered lodging accommodation prior to sailing to America, and to protect migrants from exploitation in Hamburg, or Hamburg from the aliens passing through from Eastern Europe. It's not quite clear. So that sense of place, site of memory, I found increasingly interesting. Bremerhaven and the Maritime Museum Genoa are both places from where people have migrated in huge numbers, and both museums obviously are more, they're places, but the building doesn't reflect that experience per se. Whereas the place of arrival, we've talked to local present, and actually the places of arrival in Sao Paulo and also in Buenos Aires are places where migrants stayed when they first arrived. And what's great about both fascinating places, but Buenos Aires, is that they've kept the traces of the history within the building. So they haven't refurbished it and covered it all with technology, but they've actually kept the traces, which I found a quality, and other people have responded positively to. So, but I've also been to a train station in Luxembourg. It's an extraordinary archive, actually, about migration worldwide, but Europe, certainly Europe. And then at the bottom is the Askavusa Collective, which they are a group of young, different ages in Lampedusa, and they have taken over fisherman's storage sort of cave, and they have collected migrants' boats and personal belongings within that. So I'll talk more about that. And then community-specific museums, Chinese Museum, Melbourne, Islamic Museum, Australia, which I kind of feel sometimes aren't involved, they're voluntary, aren't involved in sort of museum ICOM or whatever, and I think there's quite a lot to be done to looking at potential partnerships here. I found the immigration in Paris is situated in the former palace of the colonies. Yeah. It's an impressive Art Deco building, but the images are uncomfortably colonial. The white man, saviour, priest, and there is little engagement with this issue. I was really disappointed about this, because I think one use of contemporary art would be to deconstruct and reinterpret this contested past, as did, say, Fred Wilson in America. He's done some very interesting work deconstructing colonial paradigms. I became interested in how museums have understood the word migrant and whose experiences are represented. Italy has got an extraordinary number of emigration museums all over, in hillsides, in Lucca. It's extraordinary. But 1973 was the point in Italy where the number of immigrants exceeded the number of emigrants. So in all these museums you have tacked on a section about immigration, which is great that there's that's acknowledged, but I kind of think, well, weren't there immigrants before 1973? You know, what about looking at the flows of emigration and immigration and how they interact? Also becoming a Copenhagen was a really interesting initiative because it includes internal migration, as actually does Sao Paulo, as well as external, and it's becoming a Copenhagen is a kind of sense. Where I did think there could have been more conversations about where are the similarities and the differences, because you can't always conflate the issues. What was extraordinary about Australia was the inclusiveness of Indigenous communities. So the effect of migration on the Indigenous communities is a real thought. You know, how would you translate that within a European context is interesting and problematic, but it was certainly within the national discourse. Every museum that touched on immigration touched on this issue. And Sao Paulo, and also the one in Rio, the natural history, talked about the first migrations of people actually arriving on continents, which is interesting. And then there are specific communities. I found my child migration, I didn't find there was a specific focus on it, but there could have been. And faith communities, certainly Copenhagen made the decision not to include them, whereas a very local migration museum outside Copenhagen had a whole section on faith. And then there are issues about forced migration, slavery, which in fact we were just talking about, and I think Sao Paulo, you look at that issue to some extent. Convicts, you know, in Australia, and trafficked women, that very strange place of this rather out of the way place outside Copenhagen. You know, this image comes from an artist's work on trafficked women. So, and then looking at the nature of migration, you know, it's so complex and so different. From transnational migration of, you know, bankers in the city, to refugees, to undocumented, to all the reasons, to third culture kids, you know, sons of diplomats. So I think it's very important that we actually look at the diversity within migration. And then what period does it cover? I've walked along timelines on the floor. This is the one in Buenos Aires, down the stairs. But I think where it stops and starts is interesting. You know, is it from the beginning of time? Is it pre-colonial? Is it post-colonial? You know, in Britain sometimes there's accusation that migration did not start in 1948 with Windrush, it started before. But where it ends is also very important. I found this small photo, well, it's talked about in Paris, which was recognised by a migrant involved in a sans-papier occupation of the museum. And it's a very little photograph of the story of this migrant finding his own photo. And then suddenly, nothing else, the whole story about the occupation of the museum, I think it was 2010, is not in the timeline. So when do timelines stop? You know, how do we engage with current issues? And the film footage of rescue near Lampedusa, 2011, that already feels out of date, given what's happening current in terms of Greek continents. I'm very interested in migration scenarios. This at Bremerhaven, extraordinary cost must have gone into, you know, these figures arriving at the dock. You press this thing to get voices of different languages from the boats. You arrive at New York Station, and then suddenly when you switch to immigration, you get a 1970s shopping complex which has not had so much investment in it, but there you go. Health controls, there are showers at the Red Star Line. The Melbourne has got a ship which shows the difference between sailing when you started sailing on the clippers to steamliners. Buenos Aires, there are lots of bedrooms, I've seen lots of bedrooms. I thought this was quite clever in Buenos Aires because they, instead of using a whole room, they actually used a mirror with an artist intervention to depict that. And also in Sao Paulo, you have the dining facilities where migrants with amazing photographs on them. And then I wanted to talk about in the steps of the migrant. basically I took a passport, this is on the top museum, and I become a person. In fact, I was an actress, so I got quite a good deal. Some of the rural farm workers had a worse deal than I did. But nevertheless, I did get stopped. I did get stopped at when I got to Ellis Island. So it is very interactive. The same thing happens at Bremerhaven, although with a recent migrant. This is a very interesting interactive, which is very critical. It uses the White Australia immigration policy. And what happens is that they did languages, they gave you a language test, but not necessarily in the language you spoke. So this interactive actually shows that a black migrant who spoke English perfectly was given a test in Hungarian and wasn't allowed in. And there's some really hard-hitting stuff here. And then this is an interactive in Melbourne where a migrant is abused on a bus, and it's what stand do you take as an onlooker? Challenging. And also you're put in the steps of an immigration officer. I sat with a child who was far stricter than I was. So I mean, it's a whole issue of what I do. I think some objects are extraordinarily strong. I'm going to move on because of time. The personal connection with a mother who we never saw again, with the top object and part of the child migrant scheme, a Vietnamese boat that rescued people across the use of objects in Lampedusa, which they've actually collected from migrant boats. And they've displayed in certain museums, and also in the fishing. But they don't give labels, interesting, because they want the objects to speak for themselves. They want to be able to touch them, feel them. All sorts of ethics around that, but interesting. Use of letters. This is from a detention centre saying, going on a hunger strike. The use of images. I'm going to skip over these because I've only got 3 minutes left, I think. The use of personal stories, very strong. From child soldiers in different ways. And the collection, Antwerp are very good. They are one of the museums that have decided that they include immigration to Antwerp, and they have a way of collecting stories. You can write them down, or you can go on the computer, or you can talk to somebody. So they're very active in collecting. I just use this handbag. It's a very outdated, sort of dusty kind of place. But one of the things I really liked about this museum, it had difficult stories, difficult experiences, people who got involved in crime after migration. And I think, this kind of glorifying of those who've made it is to be probably, cartoons, very, very powerful. Contemporary art, this is a piano that came across the Atlantic, now sort of rocks like this within the thing. This is intergenerational, not being able to speak because they speak different languages. Very use of contemporary art. If I was white, I could wear a suit. I think it's contemporary art, and the placing of this is extraordinarily strong piece. But it's not really about migration, it's about race. And I think it's quite important that we actually start to make that distinction. And use of film, use of newspapers. If you look at newspapers over decades, you find that they're saying the same things but with different communities. Context, of course, is important. But I just wanted to talk briefly about the Te Papa, which was a collaboration with young refugees. And the 3 tables you see is some very powerful work by young people. But she was very open about the collaboration because she felt that, the museum would only go so far. They would allow the people to create work, but they couldn't participate in the design of the whole exhibition. And I think we have to be quite honest about the levels of collaboration and co-production we get into. I was impressed by Antwerp because they employed, I think it's 25 trackers to actually go and research what they wanted to research, which was very impressive, and trained people, and they brought back, and it's a very cohesive exhibition, temporary exhibition. So I was impressed that the museum was open, brave enough to do this. And this is just the Migration Museum project in the UK. everybody knows somebody who's a migrant, everybody's married to or has intersected, and that kind of sense of including everybody, that this migration story involves everybody. So just to summarise, I'm interested in the significance of place, making, who we include and exclude from migration, how we link the historical with the contemporary, what methods we use, and how we share power and build trust and collaborate. And I am interested in education because I think places of dialogue are extraordinary. And I think that some of the most impressive work I've seen, which I haven't gone into, is when bringing people together in educational or more informal settings. And I think that we have to, changing lives perhaps, but I think we have to be far more rigorous in how we impact that and share knowledge of actually how that is achieved and not be so live and blatant about it. Thank you.